Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Anthony Salas, and on behalf of Welcoming America, I'd like to welcome you to today's member-only webinar titled Inclusive Emergency Planning. At Welcoming America, we provide you, our members, with content and information that supports the work you are doing within your community, and our webinars are just one way that we do that. If you'd like to access past webinars and other resources, please go to welcomingamerica.org/learn/resources. And from there, you can search by type, topic, and keyword to find the resources that you are looking for. And just wanted to also bring to your attention some of our upcoming webinars that may be of interest to you. Like you, as the COVID-19 crisis continues to evolve, we are gathering as much information and resources as we can to share with you during this very difficult time. And today's webinar will be the first in a series of webinars dedicated to specific topics related to COVID-19. And on your screen, you see the topics that will be covered over the next 5 weeks, with more that will be added later. You will receive more information about the registration for these webinars toward the end of today's webinar, but again, wanted to give you a heads up as to what is coming in this series of webinars. And at this time, I am excited to introduce and turn things over to our presenter today, Virginia Fitchett, who is the Assistant Director for Family Reunification at the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. So Virginia, I will turn things over to you.
Great, thanks Anthony. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to participate in the next hour of discussion around inclusive planning for emergency responses. I want to set out some expectations and get you energized for the learning that we're about to be doing together. The first thing I will just add is that the subject can be one that can trigger negative responses or memories for some folks. So please ensure that you're protecting your own well-being as you're engaging with the content. Normally when I'm presenting in person, I can sort of ask for a high sign if someone's gonna just take a moment to themselves. The content can get a little bit heavy. So I'm just asking you to be mindful of that during the presentation. And secondly, grab a pen and some paper or a notebook, and I'd like to get you ready to participate. I want to make the webinar as helpful as possible, and so there'll be plenty of areas for rhetorical questions and thoughts to get you started. And then we're going to have some discussion with some different providers later on in the training to see how you can really operationalize some of the content that we're going to talk about. Now, the subject of inclusive emergency planning is very large. And with only 1 hour to talk to you on the subject, I'm going to be referring back to written resources and providing you with some guidance at the end of the webinar that will point you in the right direction for other resources, especially around COVID-19 and how to engage with the newcomer communities around that. There are a lot of different providers who are pulling together a lot of resources, and so I've pointed you in the direction of some of those. Now, the goal of the conversation today is to share some insights from the learnings that LIRS has done in our deep engagement with vulnerable communities, and to engage in some assessment and operational work that will help you to prepare as you go back to your own agencies, to your county health departments, to your communities as you're responding to the crisis at hand, with always that eye on the horizon to the institutionalizing emergency planning that's going to be inclusive of the vulnerable populations in your communities. So to get started, I'm going to provide you with a brief introduction to who LIRS is and why I'm in front of you today. We're going to go through some of the concepts of discussion around how emergency responsive can be inclusive and what to think about as you're doing that. And then we're going to have an active engagement session with 2 members from Welcoming America who are going to provide you with some really interesting operational insights into some of the tools that I'm talking about in the training today. And then I'm going to present some resources for further review for you as you get deeper into your own practical planning around inclusive emergency response. Thank you, Anthony. We'll head on to the next slide. Great. So who is Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service? Well, we are a faith-based organization founded in 1939. And as you can hear, my dogs are very excited to share that with you. I apologize. In the time of COVID, we're all working remotely. But LIRS, as I said, is a faith-based organization that was founded in 1939 by active Lutheran congregations in America. And something that was really interesting for me to learn when I joined the agency is that back in 1939, 1 in 6 displaced people in Europe was a Lutheran. So we have a very deep root of welcome and reception for refugees in the community in the Lutheran faith. And one of the things that we do is we implement programs on behalf of migrants as well as refugees. We serve through the network of refugee resettlement services. We work to reunify children with their families through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We conduct policy advocacy, and we pursue humanitarian alternatives to immigration detention. So we're very busy in the space of newcomers, and we have a long history of service and engagement with that population. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our learnings that we have through these various service lines as we're thinking about how your community can respond in this kind of emergency and be inclusive of those newcomers. So we'll go to the next slide, Anthony. Great. So this, in the time of COVID, is one of my favorite cartoons. It's just something that I've felt when I've looked at my freezer or had that pantry day lotto of, I have a recipe with 12 ingredients and I've got 5 of them. How am I going to make something that my children will eat? And so I imagine a lot of you have had a very similar experience facing your refrigerator these days. But I love Garfield's attitude here. And it lends itself really well to the idea of framing the conversation in your community around responses to crises. We're living through a very challenging crisis right now in COVID-19. And the severity of that crisis, I'm not trying to understate it or downplay it, but bringing a little bit of brevity and humor certainly helps people to lift their spirits. It also helps them to open their minds to different ways of thinking about things, right? Crisis can make you either really excited for new opportunity, or it can make you hunker down and be intransigent. So it's always good to think about ways that you can frame the information that you're providing. It gives us an opportunity to examine how we're serving our mission. How are we coordinating with like-minded community stakeholders? And how are we framing these conversations around newcomers with those who might have different priorities for resources? You know, newcomers are a very polarizing topic right now, and I generalize very specifically because every community is going to be very different. Every organization is going to have a different mission. But you're on the call today because you serve the vulnerable in your local area, whatever vulnerable population that is, and you are looking to discover other ways that you can champion their needs and make sure that they are included at the table when we're thinking about disaster response. And look at Garfield here, right? He's presented with a challenge. It's a disaster in my brain. I just don't have what I want. And then, hang on, how can I turn this into something better, right? So certainly this situation is not something that's going to be great, but there are certain silver linings that we're all trying to find in the current climate. Being in the work that I'm in with child welfare, and after 10 years, I have to continue to be an optimist in that sense. And so when we're thinking about how disaster response can be framed, it's really going to be crucially important that we think about who's in the room. Who are we talking to? What are their priorities for resources? How can we frame this conversation in a way that will be impactful and be more palatable depending on the audience that we're talking to? Now, every community and every family and every person is going to be different. So how you're going to interpret this information, how you're going to think about framing will look different depending on what your goal is. And we're going to talk a little bit about that goal planning later in the training, but I'm laying some of the breadcrumbs here to provide you with a clear pathway as we're thinking about inclusive response. And the first big breadcrumb that I want to talk about is this concept of framing. It's going to be crucial throughout your operational phases during this COVID, that you're constantly adjusting your frame as information becomes new to you, as we learn more, as the circumstances change. You're going to want to really think about how you're adjusting your lens or your frame to better serve the newcomers in your community. So Anthony, we'll head to the next slide. So in the interest of time, I've pulled together the other concepts that are, to my estimation, the most urgent and immediate for you to consider when you're thinking about the concept of emergency planning that includes vulnerable populations. I'm going to address each of the concepts on this slide in turn, and as they specifically relate to vulnerable populations more generally. I do continue to say this, but it continues to be true that each community and each area of the country is going to be different. And so it will present its own set of unique challenges and opportunities for you. So I hope to provide you with some general information that will support you as you work within your own agency and your own community to reach your emergency planning goals. Each of the topics could easily take more than an hour in just and of themselves. So I'm intended to target an introduction to target these different subjects with an introduction and provide some guidance and some further resources. So I'm going to focus very specifically on the newcomer populations as we're thinking about them. And there were some questions that were provided before the training that I'm going to try to hopefully address a little bit in each one of these slides. But these general themes with the overarching theme is around thinking about our framework. And then within the thoughts around our framework, we're going to talk about these three separate concepts. And I'm hoping that at the end of these different concepts, we're going to have a really fruitful discussion with our panelists. So I'm really excited about moving toward that. Anthony, we'll head to the next slide. So just some general considerations about newcomers in America when we're thinking about the local community outreach. Newcomers are a part of every community in America, but their visibility and their engagement with services can be limited by a variety of things, right? Newcomers face unique challenges as they live and work in a new environment. They have all come to your community from somewhere else, and they have left behind the familiar and often dangerous in favor of what they hope will be security and safety, right? Often, newcomers struggle with the challenges of day-to-day living. But they don't have time or energy to face the mental and emotional issues that accompany these major transitions, the loss of the familiar, the disappointment that the new community might not be providing to them what they had hoped. And this is where service providers play a crucial role, right? It's important that a service provider is able to understand these circumstances for their newcomers in their community and address and change the lens that you're using to attempt to communicate with them in a way that's going to help the newcomer. So it's our role as service providers to adjust to our community, not vice versa. We're not trying to mold our newcomers to what we want. We're trying to shape for the newcomer the lens that we are using to do it, right? So just thinking through in terms of what are some considerations that newcomers might be facing in their new life in America. Now, obviously, this is a large generalization, but language barriers are certainly a consideration. Before I started work at LIRS, I had no idea that there were over 200 indigenous Mayan dialects that are spoken still in the world, and the majority of them in rural Guatemala. So when we come to service and we go to local communities where a significant population that we're working with are from rural Guatemala, they speak Spanish, okay, great. But we find out when we get deeper into service that their level of Spanish is very limited, and they can't express in Spanish these emotions, these concerns, these issues of loss or pain or discomfort as they could in their native language, being Quiche or Quetecal or Mam. And so for service providers thinking about the language that's available in the language that's predominantly spoken, and how you can best incorporate those languages will be crucially important. And we're going to talk a lot about language later on. So I just want to highlight here that cultural language barriers is a problem. And as we also can head into, other than language barriers, there are very large cultural differences that abound in the majority of communities. Cultural differences are not new. They're not related just to newcomers. You know, my husband is from New England and I live in Maryland on the East Coast. And so we're about 500 miles apart. And I thought that we had had a relatively similar upbringing, you know, and I go to Cape Cod, Massachusetts for the first time, and they're all looking at me like, oh, this is so sweet. You guys eat crabs. Isn't that cute and quaint? And I'm like, what's going on? I'm very confused. And so it was a really interesting moment of just cultural difference within the same community, within what you think would be a very similar socioeconomic circumstance, very similar geographical region, and yet there was a significantly different cultural understanding of my experience living on the East Coast in Maryland to the New Englanders who live on Cape Cod. And I say that because it's important for us to remember that these cultural differences are not just limited to our one newcomer population or to one or two pockets of different people. They abound in different circumstances. And so when we're thinking about cultural competency, and we're going to get into a lot of that later, it's just important that cultural awareness and differences are recognized when we're thinking about the best ways to make outreach to these communities and how we're going to be doing this assessment. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But depending on a newcomer's experiences and circumstances, they will be more or less connected to your community systems. Refugee clients who are resettled through the State Department are connected to services in their first few months of arrival, but then they're expected to, quote unquote, integrate with varying amounts of success. And newcomers with no official status, which is the majority of the newcomers that I've worked with in my programs, these newcomers with no official status right now are more isolated than others because they lack experience with supportive systems. Their countries of origin do not have supportive systems where you don't trust the police in these rural areas where our families are from, where in my work. Families are coming from prosecutorial systems in their countries of origin. They are not familiar with someone being there to help, or having inalienable human rights is a concept that's totally new to a majority of newcomers. And so when we're thinking about the best way to make this outreach, being aware of this just general isolation from these systems and a lack of trust in those systems is really important, because what you're doing as a service provider when you're thinking about the concept of emergency planning is you're building that trust in that community one step at a time. And the local assessment, just getting an assessment of the lay of the land and how I'm going to conduct my outreach, is really important as we're laying the framework. For these populations, just in general, it's really important that we recognize that the intense national rhetoric is very challenging. Intense national rhetoric around any divergent area or polarization of our country can be really challenging. And the response to the COVID-19 epidemic is no exception. And so it's important for us to be aware of that. We don't want to deny that there are these issues that are arising. We want to think about the best frame or the best lens to use with whatever audience we're thinking about reaching and what the goal is going to be. And it's crucial for us to break down the silos within our newcomer communities and leverage the trust that we can build, or we have built, as we're thinking about leveraging that for community emergency response. Anthony, we'll head to the next slide. Thank you. So here's some questions to ask as you're thinking about this initial scan of your community. So you're aware of all of these very specific challenges that you're going to face. You understand about language. You understand that cultural competency is going to be important. You're aware of the national landscape. You're really prepared, and you're ready to get stuck in. And you're looking at the local community assessment. And as you think about operationalizing your action planning, what you're going to actually do, it's important to think about what what method you're going to utilize. Are you going to do a formal asset mapping? Are you going to do a survey of local stakeholders to see who's already working with this population? Are you the anchor organization who's already doing it? Or is it going to be something as simple as creating an outreach schedule to new stakeholders and you can leverage existing partnerships? What I would recommend here is the enemy to process is complication, right? In a time of crisis, everything is going to feel immediate, and it's important to slow it down and see where there are kinks. And I'm so excited that we're going to be able to talk to our two panelists later today to hear about how they are operationalizing some of their planning strategies. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of these operational action planning and SWOT analysis later. But I want to lay the groundwork here for that because it's going to be really, really interesting to see how it's being worked out in practice. But the questions that I would have on this slide before you begin your scan are really crucial ones. It's important to recognize that for every emergency planning in every community, there is a table where emergency planning is happening. Do you know where that table is? Are you already sitting at the table? If you are, who else is at the table? And who has relationships with the community that you're trying to reach? If it's not you, right? Are the participants at the table on the same wavelength as you? Are they aligned in your desire to be inclusive of vulnerable populations in the emergency planning? If they're not as aligned with you, how can you align them? What frame can you use to approach them about the subject? In what way could you leverage those existing relationships for the betterment of inclusion of vulnerable populations? Okay, Anthony, we'll move to the next slide. So as we're thinking about relationship building and outreach, it's really challenging to start with that when you're in a time of crisis. And knowing what I know about the amazing work that's being done by Welcoming America and the partners of Welcoming America, I know that you have all built strong relationships with your vulnerable populations in your community. And now is the time to leverage that trust and act as a representative or envoy to get those needs heard at the table. And how do you go about doing that, right? Relationships are crucial at a time of crisis. When you already have a relationship of trust with the vulnerable community members, it's that much easier to reach them and to hear what their needs are, and then to decide on a strategy to get those needs elevated up at the table. If your agency doesn't have those strong relationships yet, then the current situation presents an opportunity to reach out, to connect in new ways, to share your desire that vulnerable communities are represented in the planning and that they're given timely and appropriate information as they make their own responses to what's happening. Right? It's important that the community as a whole is welcoming to all of its neighbors. And your action planning regarding outreach is going to be shaped by your answers to these questions on this slide. And they're definitely going to be there around the level of impact as well. So, if you're thinking about whether or not your agency wants to be the anchor organization and act as a broker for all of these other agencies to fall behind, how much effort will that take? What will be the impact of that? And do you have the bandwidth to do that? Is that an appropriate goal for right now in this moment? Or is that a long-term action planning goal that you're sowing the seeds for right now? These are all really crucial questions to ask yourself as you're thinking about your next steps in your action plan. Okay, Anthony, we'll move to the next slide. Cultural competency. It is a buzzword in human services that I think anyone doing this work has come across so many times in their professional life. It's hard to remember that it's really important. I have up here what I think are the really most important tenets around cultural competency that we have learned over the years in our work at LIRS. I like to think of cultural competency as a cycle, right? It's something that you're constantly working toward and acquiring, and it's ever changing. Cultural competency is not something that's static. It's not something that can be, you know, quote unquote, acquired. It's something that you build. It's a skill set that you are learning, and you're doing that through the cycle of listening and learning and being present, right? I find that I recall when I was thinking about cultural competency in this metaphor, I was thinking about the fact that I recently, well, now months ago now, I feel like it was recently, time I feel like has no meaning for us in this COVID-19 housebound environment. But this was now some months ago when I was teaching one of my sons how to ride without training wheels. And by teaching, I literally was just hanging on to the back of that bike and offering him encouragement and occasionally, you know, more balance on the left, more balance on the right, feel your feet, to sort of coaching rather than teaching. No one teaches someone how to ride a bike. You just are there and you're a coach, right? And you're there and you're present and you're learning and you're listening to what's happening and you're watching that person on that bike. You're watching whether they lean to the left or to the right, and you're providing coaching, and it's up to them whether they're going to fall or not, right? But you're trusting that they are going to be ready, and they are trusting you to hold on until they're ready to be released, right? And it took my son about 10 minutes before he was ready to be fully released. His balance is amazing because he plays ice hockey. So it was just, you know, a striking moment. But I thought about that very specifically and very brightly when I was thinking about cultural competency. And I know it's a metaphor that sounds weird, but you're constantly learning and listening and watching and being present. And you have to be 100% present in that moment. You can't be looking at your phone. You can't be thinking about dinner. You have to be physically present and with that other person when you're going through this process. And that's what it takes to really build cultural competency. You need to be present and aware and listening to what that person is saying to you. And you're learning from the people who lived it. You're learning from the experts. Continuous and intentional building of this cultural competency is going to happen over and over in a cycle with various community stakeholders in a way that's going to enable your services. And by the services, I mean the services of your wider community, not just you, but it's going to help you to feel that they are actively engaging in the solution, right? Service providers are great champions for the clients that they serve, but the listening and the learning from those clients themselves is of crucial importance, and ensuring that they then feel empowered to be a part of that process and that you could potentially be the conduit for them to be part of the process is really important. For any learning like this to occur, it's going to have to be intentional, and it's going to have to be continual on a cycle, and it's going to have to be with the right language, right? And this is where we come back to language again. Language and communication are crucial to every human interaction, and cultural competency is no different. But here's the challenge. Language, in this moment of social distancing and communication, thinking about new ways to communicate is crucial. What method can we use to reach the most vulnerable in our community? Thinking about what assets we have. What is the barrier? What is the asset? Going back to the SWOT analysis that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, right? How can we get a good sense of what would be the most effective? What do we use as service providers when we're reaching this population? If we don't normally reach this population, but we want to, who is the trusted broker we could talk to about this, right? Is there a word for disaster in their native language of your local community? Is there a word for emergency in the native language of your local community? How does that community normally handle crises, right? When you're speaking to a staff person or a friend who is a former refugee from South Sudan, the idea of a crisis is going to look very different based on their experiences, right? Colleagues and friends of mine have lived through the Ebola crisis. You know, we're lost boys of Sudan, you know, have been child soldiers. So, you know, the lens through which that person is going to look at the current situation and understanding is going to be very different. How are you going to frame your language or your communication to be as effective as possible with a good understanding of who that community is. So if you have built a good cultural competency for your local community, you are a perfect actor in this moment to then funnel that up as a conduit at the table, right? We're going back to the table around emergency planning. Who at that table is thinking about the needs of the vulnerable in the population? Who at that table is your natural ally? If you are not there at that table yet, how can you get there? And if you are there, how are you using that position to affect appropriate services and represent those clients? Okay, Anthony, we'll head to the next slide. So this slide here just dictates some questions to consider when you're thinking about cultural competence in your community. And I did highlight a few of them already, but just thinking about what languages are spoken in your community, who is focused on communication at the table, right? Who's the communication specialist? And we're very lucky that in a few moments, we're gonna have a communication specialist from a local community on the training with us, which I'm really excited about. And are we sharing the resources between all the actors that need to see them to communicate for all of the citizens, right? I recently saw a video from our local fire chief, right? And it was a video that the county had put out, and it made it through all of the social media channels. And it was explaining what first responders will look like right now to help you to understand that they'll look very different than they normally would, right? With protective gear. And I kept thinking, are they issuing this in Spanish? Are they issuing this in Hindi? Are they issuing this in Amharic? Are they recognizing that our community is diverse and that other people in our community who don't speak English as a first language are going to need to have access to this? And so that's where immediately I thought, well, I don't know who's at my community table, but maybe that needs to change. So of course, that's how the local activist in you comes out. But it's another thing to think about. Are we sharing resources in the interest of all of our citizens? Are we being inclusive? And to that end, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony, because Anthony will be able to introduce our two other speakers on the panel who are going to talk about how we are operationalizing some of these activities. Anthony, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Virginia. And yeah, so what we are going to do at this point, I know everyone did receive an email after your registration with a pre-webinar activity, and that was first to include a SWOT analysis that you could do to kind of help prepare you for today's webinar, along with a template for action plans after. And what we've done is we have asked a couple of our Welcoming Network members to join us today. They have completed their analysis and are gonna have a little bit of a discussion with Jenny about what that process was like and what they are doing within their respective communities. So I would like to introduce our two members. We're being joined by Saktia Pai, who is with the Long Beach, California YMCA, and also Jacob Schacht, who is with the city of Battle Creek, Michigan. So Saktia, Jacob, and Virginia, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm really excited that we have representatives from a community organization and from a city. I think it's going to provide a really interesting insight. And Sakti, you talked a little bit about the SWOT analysis, and that you as an organization have actually, conducted that prior to this actual question. Would you mind sharing a little bit with us about how that went for the why?
Hi everyone, this is Saktia Pai from Long Beach. Thank you, Anthony and Ginny, for organizing this platform to engage all partners and networks across the country. Yeah, as you mentioned, we had done the SWOT analysis over a month ago, because we want to regroup and re-strategize in order to respond to this situation. For our YMCA, we are completely different because we are not a swim and gym YMCA. We are not a membership Y. We are non-traditional Y. That means We don't have childcare services. We don't have gym and swim. We don't have any memberships. All we have been doing is to provide free services, and most services are essential services, from providing food, supplies, gift cards, providing mental health services and early intervention for individuals experiencing mental health concern and crisis, and other issues with rental assistance and other support. So when this outbreak happens, we know that we have to keep providing these services, because these are the most essential services needed for the community to respond to these problems. So at the same time, because we are a non-membership wide, we rely on funding, we rely on the support from private foundations and government contracts. So we try to keep ourselves and position ourselves as the main essential services provider, so that the state and the city keep supporting us to continue providing these services to the community. And one of the greatest strengths that we have is that I myself, leading this effort, is a newcomer immigrant myself. And my staff team, most of us are newcomer immigrants and children of immigrants. We can empathize what other immigrants are going through. 90% of our constituents are undocumented immigrants. And as the immigrant serving organization like Community Development YMCA, we keep providing these services to ensure that when undocumented immigrants cannot turn to other support and public assistance, our YMCA can still support them with these services. In Long Beach, there are around 128,000 immigrants, and over 30,000 of those immigrants are undocumented, including thousands of youth who are on DACA. So they are not eligible for public assistance. They are not eligible for unemployment benefits, even though many of them got laid off. And with the stimulus package, they are not eligible for $1,200. So they are not eligible for anything. So while doing the SWOT analysis, we had to look at our situational analysis. We need to use some assessment to reassess the situations and try to mobilize the resources so that we can keep providing the services to the community. So for us, we try to adapt to the situation, respond to the situation, and try to keep ourselves in a position where we can still open to provide the services in person. So from the Community Development YMCA, this has been our main focus, and we want to make sure that we can still keep providing the services in person.
So we have a very similar, we have a program that works frontline that provides biometric fingerprint services for the potential caregivers for children. And it's been very challenging for us to think about how we can continue to provide frontline services while mitigating risk as well. Shakti, when you were thinking that through together as an organization, and what was your next step after you performed your analysis? So you did an analysis of sort of where there were potential barriers or threats to your very survival or your ability to have services, people come to your door. How did you think through what the next step was going to be after you did an analysis? And then you mentioned in our earlier conversation that you had a plan, you put together a plan, and that's why you can still be serving the way that you are, because you thought about this and you put a plan into place. Could you talk a little bit about how that went for the why?
Yeah, well, we have our next plan, and our plan always evolve and changes because we are non-membership wide, we rely on funding. So our next plan is to make sure that we can keep the funding and mobilize the resources, positioning ourselves in the city and the state, so that when we can benefit from the stimulus package through the city and the state, we can continue to provide our services. There's a great trust with the community and the stakeholder, and we are so fortunate that our staff are very diverse and culturally competent and bilingual in different languages. Mm-hmm. So our next plan is to disseminate to the city and the state and the private foundations, letting them know that we are still here. And we are the frontline YMCA providing essential services with a great cultural competency and language capacity and the trust and the relationship that the community and the Y have here in Long Beach. So our next plan is to keep spreading the words of what we are doing, disseminating the plan that we have, the existing effort and capacity, so that they know that we are still here. And if there are funding opportunities or resources available, we would be the first one that they would turn in. For example, yesterday I received an email from the city of Long Beach sending us a funding opportunity because they know that we are still here providing essential services in person, and they know our capacity. So our next plan is to make sure that we let people know that we are still here and show them what our plan is. And then when they have resources, they would turn to us.
That's great. Thank you, Satya. I really appreciate your insights from the position of a local frontline human services organization who's deeply rooted in the community and has a very strong grasp of the community's needs. Jacob, I would love to turn to you if you could introduce where you're from and where you fit within your state's organization. That would be fantastic, because I think you bring a very interesting perspective to this conversation.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I'm Jacob Schacht. I'm the assistant to the city manager here at the city of Battle Creek. And so, you know, with a strong emphasis on the two part, I'm, you know, kind of a, you know, little part in the operation, but you know, the city, in, you know, following a lot of, you know, FEMA best practices with incident command and whatnot, you know, we've created a unified command structure that's, you know, kind of lingo from FEMA, but anyway, and particularly establish a joint operation with the county. And so we've been able to coordinate the city manager, the county administrator, and then the public health director, you know, coordinate responsibilities together and then oversee what's a pretty substantial command structure with an operations section and different task forces on vulnerable communities, for example, businesses, law enforcement across the county, and all in an effort to coordinate stuff. And so I support the communications task force, and specifically the main public information officer for the JOC, the Joint Operations Center, and I support them by translating and or arranging interpreting for any communications that come out, particularly Spanish, Burmese, and American Sign Language.
That's really interesting, Jacob. I thought it was particularly interesting how, when you were thinking about in terms of the response of to COVID-19 within the community, an area that you noted as an area of challenge was around getting interpretation, or the time that things take to go through the various channels of government. I feel like there's like a level of bureaucracy that things have to go through for reasons, but like how that must delay your processes when you're having a piece of information crucial to the community coming out, but it's ready in English maybe 6 times faster than it is in the other languages. How have you been sort of, you know, figuring out the best ways to navigate some of these barriers?
Sure. So, in an incident, it's all about, the right delegation of tasks. If
Hmm.
tasks start to bottle up, then you bring somebody else in and you redelegate. And so it's mostly, constantly sort of, thinking about how are we delegating our process.
Hmm.
And so, for example, translation comes back and then, it's meant to go through communications before it's released. And so, we thought through what steps are they taking, putting it on, using our website, for example, putting on a document center. It's got to be linked on this page, and usually there's a URL underneath it, or maybe the title needs to be altered or something. And then it goes out to social media with a little blurb to introduce it, and then maybe somebody's tagged. So we really, break down the system, the process, and try to redelegate as well as possible. So somebody with website credentials, they will update the website, for example, and put the document up there, and that's been able to help things move a little bit faster. Yeah. So.
Ginny, can I add something from Sophia in Long Beach with the language access?
Yes, please do. I'm sorry. I was experiencing some technical difficulties.
No problem. Yeah. In terms of language access, Long Beach YMCA through our new American Welcome Center, I think most of you know that the YMCA across the country have the new American Welcome Center, and we are one of the new American Welcome Center across the country. And language access is one of the biggest focus through the new American Welcome Center. For us here in Long Beach, we work with the city to support the translation and interpretation of the guidelines and the policy in place into different languages. It's very challenging because there are so many communities who are not a non-English speakers. When they are experiencing any flu-like symptoms, they don't even know who they can reach out to, because they don't even have a primary doctor, because they are undocumented. They don't have health insurance. When they call, it's challenging for them to communicate in English when the interpretation is not provided over the phone. So for us at the Y, we are ensuring that when they need interpretation assistant or translation assistant, we are here to provide them based on our capacity. And if not, we try to look for any interpretation and translations services, so that we can ensure that they can communicate and express their needs during this crisis. So yeah, it's very challenging. The struggle is real when it comes to the language access in the underserved cultural immigrants and refugee communities.
Thank you for that, Sokti. Jacob, have you found that the community has been supportive of your efforts to, work with translating into different languages and sort of outreach around communications? I know that you have a diverse population there as well, and so I would just be curious from your perspective in the state government sector about how have you found engaging with nonprofits, if there are lessons learned that you'd like to share around how community stakeholders can engage with those systems that they might have a little less familiarity with?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so, so first off, some local nonprofits have been extremely open to, getting more language access around the community. And we've been, working out the kinks over, a couple of years. And they've been always extremely responsive. Our language services providers are also nonprofits. They certainly understand how important it is, and they're willing to respond really in a moment's notice. It's been pretty awesome. And so they, yeah, they've been really open to helping, you know, thinking about how in other towns, you know, it's all, you know, there are a lot of cities in America. So, you know, and each one's going to have their own little reaction. But, you know, I think one of the important things to understand is that, you know, the city is doing something. That table you were talking about does exist. So, you know, whether it's a unified group or not, that may change, but, you know, it's there. And so, you know, you always start simply on the city's website. You know, how are they, you know, dropping, you know, putting resources up there, you know, who's the org and involved, you know, the letterhead, that kind of stuff. And you'll get a sense of who's calling the shots, and then, you know, reaching out to them, understanding, you know, what you can provide and able to provide, being, you know, pretty specific, because things are really moving, and, you know, we need decisiveness and whatnot. So, so yeah, so those are, I think, are, you know, kind of helpful, and you may be surprised. I you know, I direct people to a lot, like the state of Michigan's alternate language web page. It's been totally news to them, but, you know, Burmese made the short list, and there's all the executive orders are done in these different languages, and so it's really cool in that. So there's a few thoughts, I guess.
That's really helpful, Jacob. Thanks. And I was just wondering if one final thought around that, you know, I hate to pick on you, but you're the only, you know, representative of the larger system that I have to pick on. So I apologize. Could you talk about how, you know, you mentioned that the interpreters are nonprofit organizations, and you guys have had relationships for numbers of years, which is fantastic, and just speaks to how well integrated your community is. For those members who might be in communities that are less integrated, is there a way that you would recommend they go about and making that initial approach to their county or their city or their state governments around, you know, being included in that at the table?
Sure. You know, I think if you've got some you know, concrete evidence, always helps. And maybe some, you know, a story in mind, you know, maybe to help kind of get away from generalities and like, oh, well, you know, taking your word for it kind of thing. Not that they don't believe you, but, you know, they may not, you know, they just don't see it up front and experience it quite in the way that you might. So, you know, having that story and, you know, concrete example, and, you know, and I think, you know, always patience, you know, you know, sometimes folks in government can get a little defensive, I guess. So, you know, it's not that, you know, we don't have time, I guess, to dwell on the bad things that we've done, or the lack of things we've done. So, you know, approaching it with patience, and, you know, making sure, making sure they're aware of, you know, everything that is indeed going on.
Awesome. Thank you both, to Jacob and to Sakti, for your willingness to engage in this conversation with me and to share some insights. Before we close the training, I know I've got 2 more minutes. I just want to speak to this sheet here that you'll see. I'm certainly not the foremost expert in emergency preparedness planning, you know, nationwide. And so I want to share that there's a number of resources that I've listed here of national organizations that are going through disaster response and can provide roadmaps and further information and resources that you can use. And I specifically, in this current time of COVID, want to point you to the Immigrant Learning Center, because here are for undocumented clients, for clients in vulnerable communities, specifically in multiple languages, and around community organizations in your area and regions that are supporting immigrants and refugees in this time of crisis. And so I really want to point you to the CDC, the Immigrant Learning Center, in the current COVID crisis is where it has a fantastic amount of national resources that are also pinpointed geographically. So, and I just want to say thank you all, and especially for bearing with me. And you hear a preschooler and dogs, and I apologize, and I thank all of you for your patience during this time. And I'm just so grateful that you were willing to invite me to speak with you. So I want to thank Anthony and Melissa and everyone on the call just for being so gracious.
Great. Thank you so much, Virginia. We really appreciate you sharing all this great insight. I want to extend a thank you also to Jacob and Sakti for joining and sharing their experience as well. Before we do close out today, again, just wanted to remind you all of the upcoming webinars that we will have. Our next one will be next Thursday, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. And this one, again, on a topic that we touched on during today's presentation. And I know a lot of you have requested additional resources and information on related to language access. So we will be sharing registration links on that webinar, as well as the others that you see on the screen now, as part of the follow-up email that I will be sending you that will contain the slides that were shared today, as well as a link to the recording. So again, look for those registration links there, and we are hopeful that you'll be able to join us for those webinars. As I mentioned, you'll get out a link to the recording from today's presentation. And if you do have any questions that we can assist with related to either the topic discussed here today or any other topic that you need help with, or if you have an idea in regards to a future webinar topic, feel free to reach out to us at events@welcomingamerica.org, and we would be happy to follow up with you on that. So on behalf of Virginia and everyone at Welcoming America, I want to thank you for your time today. And again, we hope to see you on a future webinar. Please have a great rest of your day. And we do wish you all good health and peace during this very difficult time. Thank you all so much.